This is Algebra 1, Unit 9, Lesson 1 on square roots. This video is going to cover the first page of the note, so let's take a look at them. Alright, so this unit that we're starting is about starting out with square roots. Okay, so what is a square root? Well, a square root is the inverse or opposite operation of squaring. It's how you unsquare something. Basically what you want to know is what was squared to get the answer that's underneath the radical. So this is the radical symbol right here, or the square root symbol. What you want to know is if you have find the principal square root and write a multiplication equation to show why it works, the square root of 25. When you do a square root, you want to know what was squared, what number was squared to give you 25. All right, that's what a square root is. So what number is squared to give you 25? Well, it would be 5 squared is 25. So the square root of 25 is 5. Okay, the square root of 9. What they want to know is what number was squared to give you 9. All right, well, what times what gives you 9? Would be 3. So the square root of 9 is 3. All right, the square root of 100. What number squared gives you 100? Well, that would be 10. Okay. What number squared gives you 0? Well, that would be 0. 0 squared is 0. So there we go. Okay, now let's do a couple little more complicated ones. All right, so the square root of 1/4. Don't let the fraction freak you out. The square root of 1/4 means you have to take the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator and do them individually. All right, so what is the square root of 1? What number squared will give you 1? Well, let's see. If I do 1, that would have to be 1 squared. So the top part of this, the numerator, is going to be 1. All right, what number squared gives you 4? Would be 2. So this is going to be 1/2. So when you have a fraction underneath the square root, take the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator, and you're all set. Okay, how about the square root of 64 over 9? Well, that's really the square root of 64 over the square root of 9. All right, so what number squared gives you 64? All right, that would be 8. So the numerator is going to be 8. All right, and then what number squared gives you 9? Well, that would be 3. So this is actually going to be 8/3. So 8 times 8 is 64. 3 times 3 is 9. The square root of 64 over 9 is 8/3. Okay, now guess what? You can do this with radicals as well. So if we have the square root of x, or excuse me, with variables as well, the square root of x squared. Well, basically what we want to know is what number squared will give you x squared. Well, that one's pretty easy. It's just going to be x. So this is just going to work out to be x. Okay, so what about x to the 6th, the square root of x to the 6th? What number squared will give you x to the 6th? Well, remember, what do you do with exponents when you multiply? You add them. So what number multiplied by itself will give you x to the 6th? Well, that would have to be x to the 3rd. Okay, now, what do we notice about the exponents here and here? Well, what kind of exponents are there? Are even exponents. So even exponents are perfect squares. Okay, so all you have to do to find the square root is divide the exponent by 2. Divide the exponent by 2. Okay, so 6 divided by 2 is 3. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So what do you think x to the 8th would be? 8 divided by 2 is x to the 4th. So the square root of an even exponent's perfect square, is just going to be the exponent divided by 2. Now, all positive real numbers have 2 square roots. One positive, which is called the principal square root, and one negative. we use the negative root when it's asked for. Technically, all square roots have two roots, a positive and a negative one. But most of the time you only use the positive one, but be aware that the negative one is there. All right, so if we give all the square roots the square root of 4, what squared will give you 4? Well, 2 will give you 4. But also, negative 2 squared. Negative 2 times negative 2 is also 4. So to show that there's two square roots, one is positive and one is negative, we put a plus or minus in front of that. So that means there's plus or minus 2 is the square root of 4. When you do this on the calculator only does the principal square root. But be aware that sometimes you may have a negative root as well. All right, the square root of 36. What squared gives you 36? Would be 6. All right, but also negative 6. Negative 6 times negative 6 is also 36. So the square root of 36 will be plus or minus 6. All right, now the square root of 1/16. Remember, the square root of 1/16 really means the square root of 1 over the square root of 16. Okay, so what squared gives you 1? Oops. Would be 1, but it would also be negative 1. All right, and then for the denominator, 16, what squared gives you 16? Be very careful of this one. It's not 8, it's 4. 4 squared gives you 16, but also negative 4 squared gives you 16. So this is actually going to be plus or minus 1/4 is the square root of 1/16. Okay, now square roots have an interesting property when it comes to multiplication. Find the value of each of the following products. All right, so the square root of 4 times the square root of 9. All right, what is the square root of 4? What square gives you 4 is going to be 2. Times, what's the square root of 9? Is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 9 is 6. Okay, the square root of 4 times 9. Well, let's see. 4 times 9 is 36. What's the square root of 36? Is 6. Huh. Notice here what we did. The square root of 4 times the square root of 9, or if we multiply them together and then take the square root, we still get the same answer. Do you think that's going to work again? Let's see if it does. The square root of 4 times the square root of 25. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 25 is 5. 2 times 5 is 10. Okay, and the square root of 4 times 25, 4 times 25 is 100. The square root of 100 is 10. Okay, so that is the multiplication property of square roots. So what that says is you can take two square roots multiplied together will give you the same answer as if you multiplied them together first and then took the square root. So the square root of a times the square root of b is equal to the square root of a times b. And similarly, if you have two things multiplied together, you can split them up into two separate square roots and you will get the same answer. Okay, so I can go multiply them together, take the square root, or I can take the square root individually and then multiply them together and I will get the same answer. Okay, now this property is useful when working with non-perfect squares. Okay, the square root of 2 times the square root of 8. Is either one of these a perfect square? No, you can't take the square root of 2 and you can't take the square root of 8. They're not perfect squares. But if you multiply them together, 2 times 8, that will give you the square root of 16. Is the square root of 16 a perfect square? Yeah, it is. It's going to be 4. Okay, the square root of 12 times the square root of 3. Well, 12 isn't a perfect square, neither is 3. You can't multiply something by itself and get 12. But, and neither can you for 3, but if you multiply them together, 12 times 3 will give you 36. Is 36 a perfect square? Yes, it is. The square root of 36 is 6. Okay, and then square root of 20 times the square root of 5. 20 is not a perfect square, neither is 5. But if I multiply them together, 20 times 5, I will get the square root of 100. What's the square root of 100? Is 10. There we go. Okay, and this also works for exponents. Remember we said even exponents are perfect squares. Well, x to the third and x to the fifth, neither one of them are perfect squares because they're odd exponents. But if I multiply them together, what do I do with the exponents? Well, I get x to the 8th. When I add the exponents together, x to the 8th is a perfect square. What's the square root of x to the 8th? Divide the exponent by 2 will be x to the 4th. Okay, all of the perfect squares that I've shown you, I've assumed that you've known. But if you're not sure about a perfect square, you can use the calculator to figure it out. All right, so for example, say you didn't know that 64 was a perfect square. Well, let's see if it is. All right, now remember the square key right here. Remember, square roots are inverses. Notice up here in blue, there's the square root symbol. So that means to use the square root symbol, you have to use the second button. So if you do second, the x squared key, notice the square root symbol comes up. And if you put in 64, you get 8. And it only does the positive square root, but it does it for you. Okay, if you do something that you want to multiply together, like when we did 4 times 25, all right, if you did the square root of 4, all right, to stop the square root, you have to forward arrow, and then times the square root of 25. And then stop the square root by using the forward arrow. So that'll give you 10 because this is the square root of 100, which is 10. Okay, so you can see there. Now this also works on Desmos. If you go to the Desmos calculator, all right, if you use the keyboard down here, there's your square root symbol right there. All right, the square root of 4. And then forward arrow times the square root of 25. Square root of 25. You'll see it does equal 10 right there. Okay, now you can also do fractions on the calculator and on Desmos under the square root. So like we did the square root of 1/16 previously. All right, second square root, just do the fraction key after that. Alpha y equals, pick number 1, and then do 1/16, and you get 1/4. Okay, now you can also do it second square root 1 divided by 16. It'll just give you the decimal answer. That's okay. 0.25 is a fine answer. That's fine. If you want to make it a fraction, just hit math, enter, enter. All right, on Desmos, if you do the square root of 1/16, I'm going to go down here. All right, the square root, you have to do it as 1 divided by 16 here. 1 divided by 16. And it automatically makes it a fraction for you, but the answer is going to be a decimal. Okay, so that is an introduction to square roots. We'll finish the rest of the notes in the next lesson.